Welcome to the Simulate Cybersecurity broadcast. We're going to talk today about the importance of continuous security validation for testing to ensure IT hygiene and reduce risk. I'm with Dr. Chase Cunningham. We're going to talk about continuous security validation, why it's essential, why it's important from both a technical perspective, from a business perspective, and the idea of unless that you're going to adopt this either directly or through an SSP, you're going to have some real problems with your cybersecurity programs. It's really essential. So with me is the one and only Dr. Chase Cunningham, former Navy Chief Cryptologist.
Cryptologist.
Oh my God.
Cyber tongue twister.
Yeah. That's a tongue twister. Did a lot of cyber forensics, analytics, worked with NSA, CIA, FBI, and other agencies. At Forrester, known for spearheading Zero Trust, and now working at Ericom as the Chief Strategy Officer. How are you? Welcome.
Yeah, it's been a crazy week already between the Twitter things and everything else. We don't get a rest anymore in cyber as far as the news cycle goes, at least.
Yeah, it's crazy. So when we look at various different industries in the world and the idea of repetitive testing, continuously testing to make sure things are secure and safe, it may not be new to IT per se. I mean, you and I probably throughout our careers have done testing and things like that, but it wasn't mainstream. And there's several things today that make it critical that it wasn't before. What are some of these things that now make it really critical?
Well, the space is so dynamic and so quick to change that you can't really sit there and kind of go, okay, at this point in time, I'm good. And then wait for another point in time to kind of go up and catch up and whatever else like that. That's where, honestly, one of the reasons I have an issue with the whole compliance checking thing is that it's a snapshot, and we're living in a movie that's continually rolling out. So it's got to be, I have to stay with it. It's got to be constant. Otherwise, that's what the adversary is kind of hoping that you are not doing. And maybe it's a character flaw, probably, but I'm always thinking about things from the perspective of the adversary. I don't want to make it easy for them. And if I do the, checkpoint in time and I, go good and I take a snapshot and that's how I'm like, life is good for 2 years or whatever. I'm giving them 2 years a window to do bad things. It just doesn't interrupt their power cycle, which is a problem.
It's true. I mean, they're continuous in a way. The way that these threats change all the time. We incorporate cybersecurity controls and things, but they're constantly testing our perimeter, testing the interior of our stuff. You have vulnerabilities, which, you think about, 10 years ago, we were looking at maybe somewhere in the vicinity of a few thousand. Today, on average, every year is 30,000 additional vulnerabilities. And that's on top of the other one. So it keeps stacking up. So all these vulnerabilities, all these changes, all these testing that these attackers do. And in some ways, it's also the dynamic nature of enterprises today, right? We're incorporating new misconfigurations and security gaps daily. In some ways, when you think about it.
Well, and your enterprise no longer is your enterprise. Your enterprise now is extended into anywhere and everywhere. I mean, I'm at home right now on my Comcast network that I don't own. My company doesn't own. I'm using my laptop. I'm pumping off of, some server where this StreamYard thing is hosted. I mean, and all of that, whether they like it or not, because of other connections, is part of their enterprise, side of this equation. So they need to be able to make sure that they've got the controls in place that would reduce the risk from that reality.
Yeah, it's true. It's so broad and so open today, and we all, when software as a service or going to a third party is the norm for architecture, you're right. It just continues to increase on top of the fact that we have our vendors, our suppliers, our contractors, and things all interconnected with us. And you're right. Also, the very channels that we talk upon are third party as well. In looking at continuous security validation, what are its components? What is it made up of?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing, in my opinion, is to understand your baseline, right? I want to know the minimums. I want to know the minimum sort of standard of what's actually in operation, what things are doing, where electrons are moving, connections that make sense. You can't understand an anomaly if you don't understand the norm. And a lot of times people will try and go and hunt for things that are outside the bounds of normality. And my question to them is always, well, what is the norm? And usually they come back and go, well, we're trying to forensically find this thing. It's a lot easier to find, a tree on fire if you're looking from the helicopter instead of in the forest itself. So these types of things make a heck of a lot of difference. And and being able to make sure that you understand what doesn't make sense. I think context is what's often missed in this space. It's telemetry is great, data is great. Data is not intelligence. That's a very real thing. And you've got to be able to have context so that you can do something. I am personally not a big fan of seeing a problem. I want to see a problem and then fix the problem.
Right. And the key is with continuous security validation, you get to do that in the ways that it probes and works. You think about it's often includes breach attack simulation, right? The idea of looking at what the attackers are doing. And what's important there too is these things have to be updated all the time because stuff changes literally daily. I do a news show every week on all the breaches of the week and stuff like that. I'm always talking about new TTPs and IOCs that come out. And in some ways, following what the attackers are doing also give us a heads up onto what the new things they're taking advantage of, maybe things that we're looking at our security landscape that we've overlooked, right? Or used to be okay, but are no longer okay, right?
Yeah, it's that staying ahead of it is we used to say in the military is you'll never fall to the level of or you'll never rise to the level of your expectation. You will fall to the level of training and reality. And I mean that's what's going to happen. So if you're not aware of what's going on and you're not in a space where you're dealing with the reality of the current configuration, you're going to wind up there whether you like it or not.
Correct. And in some ways also, we talk about other industries and other places, the military, for example, who practice over and over again, is because they realize when a real firefight occurs, you are going to be dropped in efficiency a little bit as your stress increases and stuff like that. So having the muscle memory, have the ability to say, there's a problem. It's a specific kind of problem and how we're going to solve it and things like that is really kind of essential to practice in some ways. So there's also a component of this, which is practicing the people and educating the people for what's going on too.
Yeah, I think it's valuable to make sure that as you're training and educating the people, that you're also validating that you have technical controls for what those people are doing, and then that you're actually protecting those individuals and those entities that are potentially causing more risk. A lot of times where we run into it when we look at it is organizations will say, well, we've got we're training people and we're doing phishing, whatever else, etc. That's fine. But are you also making sure that if you see that there's a vector that's valid, that you're making sure that you're applying a control to remove the risk from said valid vector? Right. If you're not, then you're missing part of the equation.
And I think that you hit on something that's really kind of important. This is not like, taking one object, one control and looking at it manually and only at that thing. It's a whole chain of things, right? It's an atomic structure that includes, like you said, if you're doing spear phishing, that includes the whole other aspect of it. Email, are your email servers spoofable? Are they patched? Do you have the appropriate DKIM records in place and stuff like that? So it's a case of hygiene that goes way beyond just the idea. What kind of attachments can you have, right? It goes way beyond just a simple looking at one thing at a time and stuff like that, which is really kind of critical.
Yeah, hygiene. I mean, hygiene's huge. And it also kind of sticks out to me when I talk to an organization. Let's just take cyber off the table. Like, think about your own personal life, right? Like me, every 3 months, because I'm paranoid, I get blood work done and I check my numbers and whatever else, and I make sure I go to the gym and all this other stuff because I want to live a long, healthy, happy life. The people that say, well, I had a physical 5 years ago, and then they go back in and get a physical and they go, oh my God, my cholesterol's at the level of the national debt. It's like, well, you weren't paying attention and really dealing with it as you had an opportunity to get ahead of it, and now you're way too far down the rabbit hole. So you should, I would hope, be doing this stuff in your personal life because it makes sense. There's logic actually in this approach.
Correct. And there's even psychology, like you're saying, in the idea of like, well, I could sit there and say, I've been to the doctor, I'm going to check that off, right? But then why am I avoiding continuing to look at my blood levels or glucose levels or whatever? The point is that there's a fear that maybe something's going to change, or I'm okay, right? Because I have a check mark. No, you're not, right? It changes. You could change daily, weekly, monthly, and you need to keep up with it and things like that. And the idea is that by doing this, in some ways, you have a lot more satisfaction and you're able to relax and have less anxiety because you know for sure. Right?
Yeah, bad's a given. As long as you're on planet Earth, something bad just happens. But it's being able to deal with it in measures that you actually can deal with it. If you if you ignore the problem, and we have lots of instances of this, eventually it gets to be a problem that's way too big, and then it's not something that's solvable.
Yeah, and then talking about security controls, right? One of the first things we talk about in the industry, first party controls and third party being the security vendors that out there, first party being things that people often don't think about. But I want to start with the third party being the vendors themselves. I can tell you how many times I've gone out somewhere and said, great, you got AV loaded, you got EDR loaded, that's wonderful. You test it, you tune it. Well, no, I haven't tested or tuned it, right? Or you have your email gateway set up. I use the factory defaults. What are some of the problems that we see out there with the factory default configurations?
Yeah, I mean, factory defaults will eat your lunch because people forget that these things come from the manufacturer, and the manufacturer typically has a way to get to it, and there's usually a default config on that back end of it. And that default thing, especially now, even if it's not a security solution, I mean, your TV in your office, your TV's got a NIC in it. There's a default login for those. Go off and Google default login creds for,
right.
And look, you've got them. And some of these other things too, where if something goes wrong, I had a really good example in my home where we lost power just out of left field. And when my system came back, I went to look at the firewall that I had set up because it was from Comcast, and it's not a knock on Comcast, but because it came from Comcast, it reverted to the Comcast default creds.
Right.
And me being a tinfoil hat guy, I was like, whoa, that's not cool. I need to go, fix it and update it. But how many people wouldn't know to do that? And like we said earlier, my network is part of your network.
Right. Absolutely. And, the key is often when vendors set up parameters, they know the parameters that will get everyone back into production and working, right? It may not be the most secure, right? So the idea is whenever you get a security control, it's set to a default standard. That means this is the easiest way to put it in and will cover most of the problems, but not really, right? So the challenge is a lot of times I find when there's default configurations and lack of tuning. And I've done this so many times, whether I was at Cisco, ForcePoint, McAfee, you go out and I see my initial work. I said, all right, I remember I told you to tune this. Did you tune this? No? Okay. Right. And that's a challenge. A lot of times that there really is a need to tune these things.
And then it's a scalpel, not a chainsaw, right?
Correct. It's crazy. And you see the best part, I think, is when you do this continuous security validation testing, you come across how these attackers take advantage of these defaults, right? So for example, there's a banking Trojan out there that's targeting specifically Mexico and Spain called Grandorario. I think I'm having a hard time with that than saying cryptographist. I still can't say it. Anyway, cryptography. Okay. But anyway, this banking Trojan, the way you would get by advanced EDRs is make the final package 400 megabytes and just send fragments over time and take as much as an hour to load. And the idea is it knows that most of these EDRs are set to say, hey, listen, if you're going to hit me with something so large and so long, and it looks pretty much okay, I'm going to let it go. Right. So the idea of these different attackers take advantage and use evasion techniques that often take advantage of the factory defaults, which I think is really kind of fascinating.
Yeah, you can hide in the noise, which is, easy way to do it. I actually saw recently where there was a script that somebody had put up on a red team forum, which if you're going to go get stuff for doing bad things, red team forum is the place to go get it, that wiped all the logs every time you did something. And it was just a script that ran continuously, like every 90 seconds or something. I mean, it was perfect because if you're trying to do what you're trying to do, the way you're going to get caught is logs. Somebody was kind enough to publish a script that will nuke the logs for you. And can you imagine having that given to you?
It'd be awesome. Yeah. It's perfect. And you think about also, I think one of the biggest things about continuous security validation is also the fact that when we look at the first party controls, so we're talking about our operating systems, our cloud controls and things like that. I am shocked to see the level of expertise that is used in getting around things that often people don't understand. The idea of permissive user permissions, legacy protocols and apps, all those kind of permissions that are default in the operating system that don't change.
Yeah, well, if you look at Windows just by its very nature, as I think there was a rule that was designed in Windows when they originally launched the operating system, was there's always 3 ways to do everything. And if you kind of think about it, like, you can right click, you can control something, you can F function, whatever. But then they added this other thing in there that's called PowerShell, which PowerShell can do all this other stuff. And oh, by the way, in most instances, you're going to be some level of administrator. Like it just becomes this, self-licking ice cream cone of misery that is available to anybody anywhere that needs to use it. And it is for the purposes of getting around some sort of restriction, which is interesting.
It is fascinating. You see that the majority of people have rights to run PowerShell. The idea of attackers getting smart about using things like MSHTA, Internet Explorer is gone, but there's still, you can send files through HTA files and it'll still enact on them. Office macros, right? Side loading DLLs. All these things are in normal Windows hygiene are now, hey, listen, get rid of HTA files. MSDT was a great way of doing tech support, no longer required, disable that. The idea of DLLs, they should be in a certain directory, and only those DLLs are allowed. You're not allowed to sideload. These are all things that over time that Microsoft has mentioned to people, and it kind of they haven't done it right. And so the idea is by doing this continuous security validation, you're truly optimizing your environment because you're taking advantage of things, whether it's in a Microsoft environment, Apple environment, or even in a situation, an Exchange server, your Active Directory, your email architecture. These are all things that have to be taken care of. And the idea also is you look at legacy apps and protocols that are still around.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff is old, and it's still out there for whatever purposes. Nobody wants to kill a golden goose, so it's still out there cooking, doing what it's doing, and it usually is woefully bad at its security configuration. So being able to remove that type of risk is valuable as well. And I think too that over time, there's actually a conversation I can have with the workforce as part of this. Is like, look, the reason I'm doing this is you shouldn't have this thing available to you. It's a risk, and it's only something that you're going to have to deal with. Let me just take that weight off of you and make sure that this is not a problem. Right,
exactly. And you look at things like either security controls are never touched, or like a firewall, they're touched too much.
Yeah.
Right? The idea, so the idea of you'll have a situation where SAP is not working, someone makes any rule to allow everything, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, your whole level of risk has gone up through the roof because of that.
I've actually been in spots where we've been doing tests with somebody that's a firewall manager, and if you've ever seen a grown person cry because of trying to make things the right way when there's so many rules they can't keep up with it, I've seen it with my own two eyes.
Yeah, that was crazy. I mean, there's just whole companies that talk about the duplication of rules and over time and things like that.
Yeah, it's a startup. I mean, if you're an X8200 person, start a company doing that.
Yes. So beyond looking at first and third party optimization of security controls and things like that, you have the SOC, the SIM, and SOAR validation. And I think with this part here is probably the biggest unsung heroes of today's cybersecurity is the SOC. And how can continuous security validation help these people?
Well, it's making sure that what they're doing is making a difference, and being able to understand the control you're pushing is going to fix a problem, and be able to do that at scale. I had a SOC with a bunch of folks in it when I was working in Dallas, and we spent a lot of time trying to make sure that what we were doing actually solved the problem. And by the time you finish making sure you solve said problem, another problem is coming at you at the speed of electrons, right? So it just continually compounds that. And I think too that these types of approaches can help solve the human capital crisis that everyone talks about, because I don't need 10,000 ditch diggers. I need one person that can operate a steam shovel, and that's what we're trying to get to. So that being able to make sure that what you're doing is useful, and that you understand how the controls are applied at the scale that we operate in business makes a difference as well.
It does, and by practice, it makes perfect, right? And the idea when you think about, you talk about a steam ditch shovel versus all these manual diggers. The idea it is that level of automation, that level of deduplication, the idea of prioritization. All these things are SOC terms, right? And does my SIM even see the attack to begin with, right? Or does it give me a million logs on something that's not important, right? And then with SOAR, which is that taking that automation to the next step and automatically coming up with proactive things and protective things, does it call the right person on the on-call person? Does it actually go ahead and get to the director it needs to make a change in policy? And does it work? And that only happens through testing, which is really
cool. You said practice makes perfect, and it reminded me of a guy that I play golf with who was a D1 golfer, his coach told him practice makes permanent. And I think that that's a really good way of looking at it is, and his thing was you practice perfectly, you get permanent perfection. That's what you're trying to get to. If you practice trash, you get permanent trash.
Correct. Right. You have to practice correctly too, which is important. So also, in looking at things here, we talk about vulnerabilities. I mentioned in the start of the call, we're now up to 30,000 a year. And that's been true since 2019, I believe, that each year is that much of an additional burden and load. And you think about how patches sometimes break things, how they take about a week to deploy and things like that. How does continuous security validation help with that kind of stuff?
Well, I mean, the side around vulnerabilities that's really interesting is not every vulnerability is actually a weaponized exploit part of that exploit life cycle. So I think being able to understand, is it just a vulnerability, sort of a Bobo thing? Yeah, I'll get to it, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Or is it this is a mother of God type thing I need to get to and actually fix and put in place? There's a lot of value in that. And then making sure that you're able to understand how you are going to put this in place and that it's not going to brick or knock anything over, because that's a losing conversation with the people that aren't in cyber. I mean, if I'm going to the folks running the business and saying, I got to shut this app down that makes, 80% of our revenue for 4 days, that's not going to work. So you've got to be able to do those types of things.
No, it's true. I think what's also kind of important is in that prioritization, if you're able to find first and third party security controls, that could be I don't want to say virtual patch, because I'm not in product marketing, but a virtual patch, that's kind of sounds like that, but in a way to mitigate, having compensating controls that mitigate are ways that allow you to see, is this going to brick my network if I actually deploy the patch? It allows you that chance to see, well, we have things that are protecting us, so we're okay. We don't do the vulnerability patching right now. It gives us time to test and things like that. So it helps with prioritization and delays, that allows you to delay, to have time to go ahead.
And it's a good way to have the conversation with the board and the non-cyber people to kind of say, like, look, this is what we need to do because of this reason, and this is how we will mitigate the risk of this being put in place, rather than I'm a cyber person, I know something's a problem, listen to me because I'm a cyber person.
Right. And by the way, let's go down that path for a second. I think that's kind of important too, about how security control validation occurs. It's not just a technical exercise, right? It's much more.
It's a business thing. I mean, we in the cyberspace, and I include myself in the mix, because we've done a real disservice to the business people as far as we've been just preaching at them. And we finally got our seat at the table, I think you could say, and we're able to have those back and forth with them. But I mean, what we're doing is about business objectives or mission objectives or whatever. If you're not able to eloquently tell them why something is taking place and the other outcome side of that equation, you probably won't get the result that you're looking for. And it's not enough to be at the table. You've got to speak the language that everyone at the table understands.
I agree. I think that's really kind of critical. And I'd argue that I've had conversations on other broadcasts where I'm talking earlier in the life cycle of a technical person in cybersecurity. And I'd argue the difference today is cybersecurity is relevant to every organization that ever exists at this point, right? The idea is you and I could say we're done with our jobs. We're going to go do a fish and tackle, a store. We still have online ordering, fulfillment, all sorts of things that require that IT be there to work, right? The cameras down at the lake to make sure no one's falling in the lake because we have a liability clause. Right. Everybody has to deal with this, and so I'd argue is where now that we have a seat at the table for real, there's also the other pressure is earlier on in your career, you will have to learn to ask questions of business people in a manner that they want to hear it, right? And help educate them in the ways that they deal with, which is business continuity, right? Business risk and continuity is the, let's say I'm a little concerned about ransomware. We just had someone hit with ransomware. So can we test in our environment how we do? Okay, and let's also check those backups and how long it takes. And we come back to the business people and say, hey, we're good. We made some changes to our security controls to be a little more secure. The backup takes 2 weeks. 2 weeks? Well, we'd be out of business by then, right? So the idea is bringing them into the conversation early is really kind of important.
Yeah, and it's only going to help the security conversation the earlier you're able to get that and make sure that there's that the total understanding of what you're trying to do and why that is of value. It's never going to ring true for them to just go, well, we have a risk and there's this exploit that'll do this and whatever else. It's got to be, this is what the impact will be over time. Because like you said, it's going to be about the business risk and the ability to take care of customers.
Yeah, it's really important, right? And also, I think the other big thing is in the past where IT spend was often considered an expense, the key is having these conversations frequently and continuously also takes us out of the expense item into a part of doing the business.
Yeah, it's instead of being the department of no, you should be the department of no, but it's actually new opportunity. And the reason that you're doing something in the context of security is that it makes something safer so that they can bring a new service, a new application, a new market, whatever into that mix, and it helps them grow in that space. Rather than we need to shut this down and restrict it because of blah blah blah. It's got to be more along those lines, I think.
True, and I think also, and both of us have a lot of red teaming experience, among other things. Is you look at the way we used to do pen tests and red teaming, and it was one of two things. It was either I'm doing this so I can get a piece of paper that says, I'm going to take my piece of paper and it's going to allow me to operate right with my insurance, with my standards or whatever, compliance, check the paper off. Or it was a situation where you come in, you do pen testing, you come in, you show the results, hit high five, and go back to your desk. And in both situations, not effective, right? Because it doesn't take advantage of the real situation and stuff like that. Who else could be brought into the actual testing?
I mean, I've actually gotten to a place where now if I'm going to engage with an organization and they start asking me about security, whatever, the first thing I ask them is, are you willing to do a red team like right now? And if they're not, then I say, we're not ready to have a real security conversation yet, because you're operating in an inherently dangerous space. You need to be ready for this type of activity. If you want to have a real security conversation, like you were talking about, we got to know where we are and we got to know what we need. But we don't know that unless we actually go at it like the adversary would.
Correct. Correct.
So I bring them all in, and I throw everybody into the mix. It's I think the meat grinder, in my opinion, is the best way to go at it.
But I'd argue, even though you're pretty tough, you at the same time, I'd argue your red teaming exercise would include some very important things. Very important things. And what would they be?
I include, everything from what are you doing for the folks that are not in the office? What are you doing for the server configurations? What are you doing for inbound, outbound traffic? How are you inputting things in space as far as localization, isolation, control? What would you do if an endpoint is compromised and if that endpoint had creds that are on a system that does X, Y, and Z? So, really trying to throw them into the mix as far as these are the things that, history tells us can and will happen. And how would you deal with that, and what controls are in place to mitigate that threat? Agreed.
I think also there's a good deal of prescriptive output, right? The idea of, okay, so blue teamers, SOC, here's the things that we were able to accomplish. Here's what you need to fix, right? I think that's critical too. I think that's what's different from red teaming in the past to now. I think there's a lot more emphasis on prescriptiveness, on here's what we need to do differently, right? And let's see what happens when we incorporate this, right? I think that's the big change that we see and what it used to be. Stuff like that.
And I think the other piece of it is that there's finally an understanding of these are not just kind of, things someone would see in a movie, sort of, hacker conversation. I mean, we have plenty of giant organizations with giant budgets that have been ripped and torn to shreds with different things. So we can say, like, you don't have to believe me. Like, here's 30 cases where this actually took place.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think the ransomware epidemic probably was the final straw in all this. We did some research last year, and the shock was, for the first time we were hearing, oh no, it is an epidemic. We've been hit too, right? I was surprised how many people were hit in that survey. But then what they were saying is we were able to recover more gracefully. We were able to recover quickly, less damage, right? You do have the nightmare stories you hear. But the reason why a lot of them were able to do that is the other responses were, because we've included the business, because the business and the board think this is essential that we get this right.
Yeah, and that's a really good point to make too. Is a lot of the breaches that have continued to happen in the last, call it, year, maybe year and a half, you're actually able to point at the organizations that had put a strategy in place, and you say, yes, they had a compromise. So what? It didn't take down the organization. It was a, it was a boo-boo. It was an owie. It wasn't an arterial bleed.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to get past. I've had a lot of workshops where somebody on the board will say, well, can you keep us from getting compromised? Like, nope.
Right.
Can't.
Right. There's no such thing as a silver bullet.
That's your standard for success, then I should leave now.
Right. Exactly. No, the world is a dangerous place. Right. Exactly. Just minimize
the boxing match and never take a punch, that type of thing.
No. Hey, if you could wear the outfit, you look good.
Right. Stand outside the ring if you want to be safe. Yeah.
Exactly. It goes back to like the idea of going to the doctor one time and then not going for 5 years. Like, I'm wearing the outfit. I'm good.
Yeah, I'm set.
Very cool. In zero trust adoption, talk to me about, how continuous security validation relates to that.
Well, I think it's what actually validates your zero trust posture. That's what you're trying to get to, right? You're crawling along this curve of where am I at, where am I going, and your ZT thing is the pinnacle up here on the far upper right of the approach. Along the way, you have to have check marks. If you're gonna take a journey of 1,000 miles, you got to start stepping. But every so often, I want to make sure I check my GPS and know that I'm going the right direction.
Right.
And that's the piece of this that's applicable, is I'm making sure that what I'm doing is making sense. I'm covering the entirety of the organization. I'm continuing to grow that coverage. And I'm also establishing and knowing the veracity of my baseline and whether or not there is something that's outside the bounds of normality that I can deal with.
Very cool. Yeah, I would agree. I think in some ways, the way you're describing those waypoints, one part of continuous security validation also is the idea that you're not just getting the baseline, you're getting the trending over time, and you're seeing it go up and down based on various things. A new technique comes out, you have that version of that application with some legacy protocols, it goes up, right? Then you make some changes, it goes back down. Then someone pushes out 10,000 new VDI desktops where everyone can use PowerShell. Whoop, it goes back up again. So the idea of watching over time, almost like monitoring. Kind of thing.
Yeah, that helps you plot as you're going. Like we talked about, it's never gonna be a truly linear walk. You're gonna meander a bit, which is okay as long as I still get where I'm going. But as I'm meandering, I'm going to continually kind of try and find that North Star so that I can keep vectoring in on it to get to where I want to be. And if I don't look and I don't know what's been tracking and what's not tracking, I am just walking around in the wilderness hoping that I get where I was trying to go.
Right. I think I'm safe, but you don't know for sure.
I think I'm safe. Oh, I fell off a cliff. Yeah.
Right. I wonder why that happened. Not exactly. Very cool. Well, excellent. This has been an awesome conversation. Chase, thank you so much for attending. This has been great. I want to thank everyone for attending the broadcast, and see you soon.